Baby saw a bear cub trapped in a bowling alley ball return. What Baby did next struck gold. The afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of Riverside Lanes, casting long shadows across the abandoned bowling alley that had been closed for nearly 3 years. Ethan Marshall pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above it giving a weak, rusty chime that seemed to echo through the empty space. Behind him, his wife, Jessica Brooks, carried their 18-month-old daughter, Haley, whose bright eyes took in everything with the wonder that only toddlers possess. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood polish and forgotten memories, and their footsteps created soft echoes that bounced off the walls like whispers from the past. Ethan had inherited this place from his uncle just 2 weeks ago, and this was their first visit to see what remained of the family business that had once been the heart of their small town. The lanes stretched out before them, 12 perfect pathways that once rang with the sound of strikes and spares, now silent and covered in a thin layer of dust that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Jessica shifted Haley to her other hip and ran her free hand along the scoring table, leaving trails in the dust that looked like tiny roads on a map to nowhere. The baby babbled something incomprehensible but cheerful, her small hands reaching out toward the colorful, faded murals of bowling pins that decorated the walls, each one painted with a different cartoon face that smiled down at them with paint-cracked grins. They walked slowly down the main aisle, past the shoe rental counter where rows of red and blue bowling shoes still sat in their cubicles, waiting for feet that would never come. Ethan remembered coming here as a child, the excitement of Saturday morning leagues, the taste of orange soda and nachos from the snack bar that now stood dark and empty behind its metal grating. He touched one of the ball returns, feeling the smooth plastic surface that had been worn down by countless hands over the decades. The mechanism inside was silent now, no longer humming with the promise of returning a ball for another chance at a perfect game. Jessica noticed his nostalgic pause and squeezed his shoulder gently, understanding without words the weight of memories this place held for him. As they continued their exploration, something unusual caught Ethan's attention at Lane 7. The ball return there seemed different somehow, though he couldn't immediately place what it was. The plastic cover appeared slightly askew, and there were strange scratches around its base that looked fresh, not like the weathered marks of age that decorated everything else in the building. He moved closer, Jessica following with Haley still in her arms, and that's when they heard it. A soft, muffled sound that definitely didn't belong in an empty bowling alley. It was almost like breathing, but different, accompanied by the faintest scratching noise that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. Jessica took a step back instinctively, holding Haley tighter, but the baby seemed fascinated rather than frightened. She leaned forward in her mother's arms, making grabbing motions toward the ball return, her little voice rising in excited babbles. Ethan knelt down slowly, peering into the dark opening where bowling balls would normally emerge, and what he saw made him freeze completely. 2 small, dark eyes were looking back at him, surrounded by brown fur that definitely didn't belong to any bowling ball he'd ever seen. It was a bear cub, somehow impossibly wedged inside the ball return mechanism. Its small body twisted in what looked like an uncomfortable position. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur still carrying that fuzzy, baby-soft quality that young bears have. Its eyes, though wild, held no aggression, only what seemed like confusion and perhaps a touch of fear. Ethan's mind raced with questions. How had it gotten in there? Where was its mother? How long had it been trapped? He stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the creature, and turned to Jessica with an expression that conveyed both amazement and concern. She had seen it too, her mouth slightly open in surprise, but Haley was reaching even more insistently now, making soft cooing sounds as if she recognized a fellow baby in need of comfort. The situation was surreal beyond words. Here they were, in an abandoned bowling alley in the middle of town, face to face with a wild animal that had somehow found its way into the most unlikely of places. Ethan pulled out his phone, thinking he should call animal control, but something made him hesitate. The cub wasn't making any distressed sounds now, just watching them with those intelligent eyes, occasionally shifting slightly in its confined space. It was then that Haley did something that would change everything. She had been holding her favorite toy, a small stuffed golden bear that went everywhere with her, and before either parent could react, she threw it with surprising accuracy right toward the ball return opening. The stuffed bear landed just at the entrance to the ball return, and the real cub's nose twitched as it sniffed at this offering. What happened next was extraordinary. The cub reached out one small paw, surprisingly dexterous for such a young creature, and gently pulled the stuffed animal closer. It didn't eat it or tear it apart as one might expect from a wild animal. Instead, it seemed to examine it with an almost human-like curiosity, turning it over with its paws, sniffing it thoroughly, and then, most remarkably, pushing it back out toward Haley. The baby laughed with pure delight, a sound that filled the empty bowling alley with unexpected joy, and clapped her hands together in that uncoordinated way that toddlers do. Jessica and Ethan exchanged glances, both understanding that they were witnessing something special, something that defied normal explanation. The bear cub wasn't acting like a trapped, frightened animal at all. It seemed almost playful, engaged in what could only be described as a game with their daughter. Haley reached for the stuffed bear again, and this time, when she pushed it back toward the cub, she also offered something else from her pocket, a handful of goldfish crackers that Jessica had packed for their outing. The cub sniffed at them cautiously, then delicately took one between its teeth, crunching it with what seemed like appreciation. This unusual exchange continued for several minutes, the baby and the bear cub creating their own form of communication that transcended species. Ethan found himself recording it on his phone, not because he thought anyone would believe them, but because he wanted to preserve this impossible moment. The afternoon light was beginning to change, taking on that golden quality that happens just before sunset, and it illuminated the scene in a way that made it seem even more dreamlike. The dust particles floating in the air looked like tiny stars, and the whole bowling alley seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was aware of the magic happening in Lane 7. But questions still remained. How had the cub gotten in there? Where was its mother? Bears weren't common in this area, though the town was near enough to the mountains that occasional sightings weren't unheard of. Ethan walked around to the back of the lane, trying to understand the mechanics of how a bear cub could have ended up inside a ball return. The machinery was complex, with various openings and passages that led to the pin-setting area behind the lanes. He noticed that one of the access panels at the back was loose, its hinges rusted through, creating an opening just large enough for a curious cub to squeeze through. As he examined the area, he found more clues. There were muddy paw prints leading from a broken window at the very back of the building, near what used to be the storage area. The trail led directly to the pin-setting machinery, suggesting the cub had been exploring and had somehow gotten turned around in the maze of mechanical passages. But this didn't explain why it seemed so calm now, so willing to interact with Haley rather than showing the panic one would expect from a trapped wild animal. It was almost as if the cub had been waiting for something, or someone. Jessica, meanwhile, had been observing something else entirely. She noticed that the cub's breathing seemed to match Haley's, a slow, steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. When Haley would giggle, the cub's eyes would brighten, and when she was quiet, it would be still as well. There was a connection here that went beyond simple curiosity, something that touched on the mysterious ways that very young creatures, regardless of species, seem to understand each other. She found herself thinking about all the stories she'd heard about children and animals, about bonds that form in the most unexpected circumstances. The golden light was growing deeper now, painting everything in warm honey tones, and Ethan knew they needed to make a decision. They couldn't leave the cub here, but calling animal control felt wrong somehow, as if it would break the spell of this extraordinary moment. He thought about his uncle, who had run this bowling alley for 40 years, and wondered what he would have done. His uncle had always been the type to find unusual solutions to problems, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. Perhaps that's why he'd left the bowling alley to Ethan, knowing somehow that he would be the one to understand what to do with it. As if reading his thoughts, Jessica spoke softly, careful not to disturb the ongoing exchange between Haley and the cub. She suggested that maybe the cub wasn't as trapped as they thought. Maybe it could get out the same way it got in, if they could just figure out how to guide it. She pointed out that it didn't seem distressed or injured, just young and probably separated from its mother. If they could create a clear path back to the broken window, perhaps it would find its own way home when it was ready. This idea sparked something in Ethan's mind. He remembered his uncle telling him about the old maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the lanes, connecting all the pin-setting machinery. If those tunnels were still accessible, they might provide exactly the kind of path the cub needed. He left Jessica and Haley with their new friend and went to investigate, finding the maintenance access door behind the front desk. The stairs leading down were dusty but solid, and as he descended, he could hear the faint sound of dripping water and the whisper of air moving through unseen passages. The maintenance area was like entering another world entirely. Pipes and machinery created a maze of metal and shadow, but Ethan could see the logic in its design. Each lane had its own section, clearly labeled with the faded numbers, and he quickly found his way to lane 7. From below, he could see the bottom of the ball return mechanism, and sure enough, there was the cub, visible through a grating. But more importantly, he could see that there was indeed a way out. A maintenance tunnel that led directly to the back of the building, probably connecting to the same area where the cub had entered. The tunnel was partially blocked by years of accumulated debris, old bowling pins, forgotten tools, pieces of machinery that had been removed and never disposed of. But it wouldn't take much to clear it, just some patient work moving things aside. Ethan began the task, working quietly so as not to startle the cub above. As he worked, he could hear Haley's continued babbling and occasional laughter, punctuated by soft sounds from the cub that almost sounded like responses. The conversation between Baby and Bear continued, a dialogue in a language that neither he nor Jessica could fully understand, but both could feel in their hearts. After about 20 minutes of careful work, Ethan had cleared a path through the tunnel. He tested it himself, crawling through to make sure there were no obstacles that might trap or injure the cub. The tunnel emerged exactly where he expected, near the broken window that served as the cub's entry point. Outside, the evening was approaching, and he could see the tree line of the forest that bordered the back of the property. Somewhere out there, he thought, a mother bear was probably looking for her adventurous baby. He returned to the main floor to find an amazing scene. Jessica had set Haley down on the floor, and the toddler was sitting cross-legged in front of the ball return, her small hand actually inside the opening, gently stroking the cub's fur. The cub, for its part, was making a soft rumbling sound that might have been purring if bears could purr. Jessica was watching with a mixture of wonder and maternal protectiveness, ready to pull Haley back at the first sign of danger, but no danger came. Instead, there was only this profound moment of connection between two young souls who hadn't yet learned that they were supposed to be afraid of each other. Ethan explained what he had found, and together they formed a plan. They would create a trail of encouragement, using Haley's remaining goldfish crackers and some beef jerky Ethan had in his truck, leading from the ball return down to the maintenance tunnel and out to the forest edge. But they wouldn't force anything. If the cub wanted to stay, they would call for professional help. But something told them that wouldn't be necessary. The cub had been exploring, had gotten confused in the mechanical maze, but now that a path was clear, its instincts would guide it home. As they prepared to implement their plan, something unexpected happened. The cub began to move on its own, not frantically as if suddenly realizing it was trapped, but deliberately, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. It carefully backed out of the ball return mechanism, revealing its full body for the first time. It was smaller than Ethan had expected, probably only about 20 pounds, with paws that seemed too big for its body. The way puppies' paws are. It stood there for a moment, looking at each of them in turn, its gaze lingering longest on Haley. Then, without any encouragement from the trail of food they had prepared, the cub began walking toward the maintenance door that Ethan had left open. It moved with purpose but without hurry, occasionally looking back as if making sure they were watching. Haley tried to follow, but Jessica gently held her back, understanding that this was a goodbye, not an invitation. The cub paused at the doorway, turned one more time, and made a sound that was neither threatening nor fearful, but almost grateful. Then it disappeared down the stairs, its small form swallowed by the shadows. They followed at a distance, watching through the grating as the cub navigated the cleared tunnel with surprising ease. It emerged on the other side, just as the last rays of sunlight were painting the forest gold, and they saw it pause again, sniffing the air. Then, from the tree line, came a sound that made everything clear, the low, concerned call of an adult bear. The cub's head turned immediately toward the sound, and it began running, its awkward baby gait carrying it quickly across the overgrown yard and into the waiting forest. Just before it disappeared into the trees, they saw a large shadow move forward to meet it, the mother, reuniting with her wandering child. The family stood there in the growing dusk, processing what had just happened. Haley was waving bye-bye to the trees, still babbling happily, seemingly unsurprised by the entire magical encounter. Jessica was holding Ethan's hand, squeezing it tightly as if to confirm that this had been real, and Ethan was thinking about his uncle again, about the legacy of this place, and about how sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't buildings or businesses, but moments of unexpected wonder that remind us how extraordinary the ordinary world can be. As they prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something glinting on the floor near the ball return. He walked over and picked it up, his breath catching as he realized what it was. It was a small golden charm, shaped like a bear, that must have fallen from somewhere during the cub's movement. But the strange thing was, it looked exactly like the logo his uncle had designed for the bowling alley 40 years ago. A golden bear holding a bowling ball, which had always seemed like an odd choice for a bowling alley mascot. Now, standing in the very spot where they had just witnessed something extraordinary, it didn't seem odd at all. It seemed like destiny. Jessica looked at the charm, then at Ethan, understanding, passing between them without words. This place, this abandoned bowling alley that they had thought was just an old building full of memories, was something more. It was a place where magic could still happen, where the barriers between the human world and the natural world could become thin enough for a baby and a bear cub to become friends, even if just for an afternoon. They knew in that moment that they couldn't sell this place, couldn't let it be torn down for a parking lot or a strip mall. It had a different destiny, though they weren't quite sure what that was yet. As they locked up the bowling alley and walked to their car, Haley fell asleep in Jessica's arms, still clutching her stuffed bear that now carried the faint scent of its real counterpart. The evening was fully upon them now, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the forest, a mother bear was probably settling down for the night with her adventurous cub safely beside her. Ethan started the car, but before driving away, he looked back at the bowling alley one more time. In the moonlight, it didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like it was waiting, patient and ready for whatever came next. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired. Jessica was thinking about the look in the cub's eyes, so intelligent and aware, nothing like the simple animal she had expected. She wondered about consciousness, about what animals understand that we don't give them credit for, about the connections that exist between all living things that we're usually too busy to notice. She thought about Haley, not even 2 years old, who had somehow known exactly what to do, approaching the situation with pure love and curiosity instead of fear. Maybe, she thought, we're all born knowing how to communicate with the world around us, and we just forget as we grow older. Ethan was thinking more practically but no less wondrously about what this meant for the bowling alley. He had been planning to sell it, to use the money to pay off debts, and maybe start a college fund for Haley. But now he saw other possibilities. What if they turned it into something different? Something that honored both its past as a community gathering place and this strange, magical encounter. He thought about his uncle's eccentric decorating choices, the way he had always insisted on keeping bird feeders outside every window, the way he had refused to use pesticides even when mice became a problem. Maybe his uncle had known something about this place that he hadn't been able to put into words. When they got home, they put Haley to bed, and she went down easily, exhausted from her adventure. As Jessica tucked her in, the toddler mumbled something that sounded like bear friend, though it could have been anything in the mysterious language of sleepy children. They stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her sleep, the stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms, and felt the weight of parenthood, the responsibility of helping her navigate a world that was both more dangerous and more wonderful than they could have imagined. Later, sitting on their porch with cups of tea, they talked about what to do. Should they tell anyone? Who would believe them? They had the video Ethan had taken, but even that seemed inadequate to capture what had really happened. It wasn't just that a bear cub had been in the bowling alley. That was strange, but not impossible. It was the quality of the interaction, the sense of communication and understanding, the feeling that they had witnessed something that transcended the normal boundaries of human and animal experience. They decided to keep it to themselves for now, their secret, their miracle. But Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the golden bear charm. The next day, he went to his uncle's house, which he was also in the process of clearing out, and looked through the old photo albums and documents related to the bowling alley. What he found amazed him. There were newspaper clippings from the 1960s, when his uncle had first opened the place, and in one of them was a story that made everything click into place. The headline read, "Local man opens bowling alley on site of historic bear sanctuary," and the article went on to explain how the land had once been a protected area for bears, before development had pushed them further into the mountains. But more interesting was what his uncle had said in the interview. He talked about respecting the history of the land, about creating a place where the human world and the natural world could coexist peacefully. He mentioned finding old Native American artifacts during construction, including small golden bear totems that he had incorporated into the bowling alley's design. Ethan realized that the charm he had found wasn't just decoration. It was one of these historic pieces, somehow worked loose after all these years, as if the building itself was trying to tell them something. He also found his uncle's journal, filled with observations that seemed eccentric at the time, but now took on new meaning. There were entries about animals that would come to the windows at night, about strange sounds from the empty lanes after closing time, about dreams of bears bowling perfect games. His uncle had written about feeling like a caretaker not just of a business, but of something older and more important. The last entry, dated just a week before his death, simply said, "The right person will understand when the time comes." Ethan shared all of this with Jessica that evening, and together they began to see a bigger picture. The bowling alley wasn't just a failed business in need of renovation or demolition. It was a threshold place, a spot where two worlds touched, and their encounter with the cub was proof that the magic his uncle had sensed was real. They talked late into the night about possibilities, about ways to honor both the building's history and its mysterious present. By the time they went to bed, they had the beginnings of a plan. Over the next few weeks, they returned to the bowling alley several times, always bringing Haley. She would toddle around the lanes, babbling happily, occasionally stopping at lane 7 to peer into the ball return, as if expecting to see her friend again. They never saw the cub again, but they found other signs of wildlife: bird nests in the rafters, evidence of rabbits in the storage area, even what looked like fox tracks in the dust. The building, abandoned by humans, had become a secret sanctuary for creatures seeking shelter. They also began to research, learning about the history of human-animal interactions, about the old stories of children who could talk to animals, about the scientific studies showing that very young children and animals communicate in ways we're only beginning to understand. They learned about interspecies friendships, about the documented cases of wild animals showing trust and even affection toward humans who approached them with the right energy. What had seemed impossible that day in the bowling alley began to seem like just one example of something that happened more often than most people realized. One evening, as they were locking up after another visit, they heard something that stopped them in their tracks. It was a sound coming from the forest behind the building, not threatening, but purposeful. They turned to look and saw, just at the edge of the trees, a large bear standing on its hind legs. It was too far away to be sure, but Ethan could have sworn it was looking directly at them. Beside it, barely visible in the dusk, was a smaller shape. The cub, perhaps, though it was hard to tell. The adult bear dropped back to all fours, and both shapes melted back into the forest, but not before the wind carried a sound to them that might have been a grunt of acknowledgement, or might have been their imagination. Haley, who had been drowsy in Jessica's arms, suddenly perked up and waved enthusiastically at the trees, calling out, "Bye-bye, bear," in her clear toddler voice. And maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was the acoustic properties of the old building, but they could have sworn they heard an echo come back, not of Haley's words, but of something else, something that sounded almost like "thank you," in a language that wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite animal either. They drove home in thoughtful silence that night, each processing the experience in their own way. Jessica found herself thinking about the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the rest of the living world, how artificial they really were. Ethan was thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind, about how his uncle had somehow known that this place needed to be preserved, even if he couldn't have predicted exactly why. And Haley, strapped in her car seat, was singing a made-up song about bears and bowling balls, her voice high and sweet in the darkness. The next morning brought a surprise. When Ethan checked his email, he found a message from a wildlife conservation group he had never heard of. They had somehow learned about his inheritance of the bowling alley and wanted to discuss a proposal. They were looking for locations to establish urban wildlife corridors, places where animals could safely move through developed areas, and the bowling alley's position between the forest and the town made it ideal. They were prepared to offer a substantial grant to convert the building into a combination wildlife education center and preserved corridor, maintaining its historic character while serving a new purpose. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence. Ethan and Jessica met with the conservation group the following week, and the proposal they presented was everything they could have hoped for. The main bowling area would be converted into an education center, where children could learn about local wildlife and the importance of coexistence. The back area, where the cub had entered, would be modified to serve as a safe passage for animals moving between habitats. And Lane 7. Lane 7 would be preserved exactly as it was, a monument to the unexpected encounter that had started it all. The conservation group was particularly interested when Ethan, after some hesitation, showed them the video of Haley and the cub. The director, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, watched it several times, her expression growing more amazed with each viewing. She explained that such clear documentation of interspecies communication, especially involving a child so young, was incredibly rare and valuable. She asked if they would be willing to share their story as part of the education center's programming, to help people understand that the boundary between human and animal worlds was more permeable than most believed. As plans for the renovation began to take shape, word spread through the town about what was happening with the old bowling alley. Some people were skeptical, unable to believe the story of the bear cub, but others came forward with their own tales. The elderly woman who ran the flower shop mentioned seeing deer peering through the bowling alley windows on her early morning walks. A teenager admitted to leaving food for the raccoons that lived under the building's back deck. The mailman talked about the unusual number of birds that seemed to congregate around the property, species that weren't usually seen in such an urban area. It became clear that Ethan's uncle hadn't been the only one to sense something special about the place. The bowling alley had been a secret sanctuary all along, known to the creatures who needed it and the few humans who paid attention. The renovation would just make official what had been happening naturally for years. But more than that, it would create a space where moments like Haley's encounter with the cub could happen safely, where children could learn that the natural world wasn't something separate from them, but something they were part of. The renovation took 6 months, during which time Ethan and Jessica were deeply involved in every decision. They insisted on keeping as much of the original bowling alley character as possible. The lanes were preserved, though no longer functional for bowling, serving instead as unique display areas for educational exhibits. The scoring tables became interactive learning stations. The shoe rental area was converted into a small library focused on wildlife and conservation. And throughout it all, they incorporated the golden bear motif that had been their uncle's signature, now understanding its deeper significance. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early spring, almost exactly a year after their first encounter with the cub. The whole town was invited, and the response was overwhelming. Families came to see the transformation. Children pressed their faces against the glass viewing areas that now looked out onto the wildlife corridor, and everyone wanted to hear the story of the baby and the bear cub. Haley, now almost 3 and more verbal, tried her best to tell the story, though her version involved the bear wanting to learn how to bowl, and her teaching it to throw a ball. As the day wound down and the crowds began to thin, the Marshall family found themselves alone in the main hall for a moment. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, creating the same golden light that had illuminated their first encounter. Haley was playing near lane 7, rolling a ball back and forth on the preserved lane, when she suddenly stopped and pointed toward the back viewing window. There, clearly visible through the glass, were 2 bears, an adult and a younger one that was considerably bigger than it had been a year ago. The bears weren't just passing through. They had stopped and were looking directly at the building, at the family watching them. The younger bear rose up on its hind legs, its paws pressed against a tree, and for just a moment, Ethan could have sworn he saw recognition in its eyes. Haley waved enthusiastically, calling out, "Hi, bear friend!" And incredibly, impossibly, the young bear seemed to wave back, its paw moving in what could have been a greeting, or could have been simply shifting position, but felt like acknowledgement all the same. Dr. Chen, who had been in the office, came out just in time to see the bears disappearing back into the forest. She stood beside the family watching the trees where the bears had vanished, and said quietly that such moments were why places like this were so important. Not just for the animals, who needed safe passages through human spaces, but for humans, who needed reminders that they were part of something larger, something that included but transcended their constructed world. She mentioned that the cameras installed for monitoring the wildlife corridor had already captured dozens of animals using the passage, but this was the first time the bears had come during daylight, when people could see them. As they prepared to leave that evening, Ethan found himself standing in the exact spot where he had first seen the cub in the ball return. The mechanism was still there, preserved behind protective plexiglass, with a small plaque telling the story of what had happened. But the plaque couldn't capture the real magic of that day, the way time had seemed to stop, the way a baby's innocence had bridged the gap between species, the way a simple act of kindness had revealed the secret life of a forgotten place. Jessica joined him, Haley sleeping in her arms, exhausted from the excitement of the day. They stood together looking at the preserved Lane 7, and Jessica mentioned something she had been thinking about. She said that maybe the cub hadn't been trapped at all, not really. Maybe it had been exploring, yes, but also maybe it had been waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right child to show that the connections between all living things were stronger than the barriers we put up. Maybe the uncle had known this somehow, had preserved this place not just as a business, but as a possibility, a door that just needed the right key to open. Ethan thought about this as they drove home through the spring evening. The trees were budding with new growth, and he could see birds settling in for the night. The same birds that would now have a safe place to rest at the education center. He thought about Haley, growing up with the memory of her bear friend, carrying that openness to wonder into her future. He thought about all the children who would come to the center, who would learn that the line between human and wild was not a wall, but a conversation, ongoing and ever-changing. That night, after Haley was asleep, Ethan and Jessica sat on their porch as they had a year ago, but everything felt different now. They had been changed by their encounter, open to possibilities they hadn't known existed. The bowling alley, which they had thought was an ending, a final responsibility from a deceased relative, had become a beginning. It had taught them that magic wasn't something that existed in fairy tales, but something that happened when you paid attention, when you approached the world with curiosity rather than fear, when you remembered that humans were not separate from nature, but part of its vast, interconnected web. As they were about to go inside, a sound drifted through the night air, the distant call of an owl, followed by another and another, until it seemed like the whole forest was engaged in conversation. And maybe it was just their imagination, heightened by the day's events, but they could have sworn they heard, underneath the owl calls, a different sound, the soft grunt of a bear, peaceful and content, somewhere in the darkness. They smiled at each other, understanding passing between them without words, and went inside to their own sleeping cub, carrying with them the knowledge that the world was far more magical than most people ever realized. The education center flourished in the months that followed. School groups came to learn about local wildlife. Families spent weekends exploring the exhibits, and researchers used the facility to study urban wildlife patterns. But for the Marshall family, it remained something more personal, a place where their daughter had shown them how to see the world through eyes unclouded by the artificial divisions adults create. They volunteered there regularly, Ethan leading tours and Jessica developing educational programs, while Haley became something of a mascot, the child who had befriended a bear. The story spread beyond their small town, picked up by news outlets interested in positive stories about human-wildlife coexistence. But something always got lost in the retellings. The quality of the golden light that day, the sound of Haley's delighted laughter, the intelligence in the cubs' eyes, the feeling that they had been part of something ancient and important. These things couldn't be captured in words or even in video. They could only be experienced, felt in the heart, remembered in quiet moments when the rational mind relaxed its grip and allowed for the possibility of magic. One day, about 2 years after the center opened, something extraordinary happened. A mother came in with her young son, who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The child was shy, hiding behind his mother's legs, overwhelmed by the new environment. But when they reached the display about Lane 7, something changed. The boy toddled forward, pressed his small hands against the plexiglass protecting the preserved ball return, and said clearly, "Bear's sleeping." His mother laughed, explaining that he was obsessed with bears lately, but Haley, now 5 and helping with the tour, looked at the boy with sudden interest. She walked over to him, knelt down to his level, and whispered something that only he could hear. The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded solemnly. Then Haley took his hand and led him to the viewing window that looked out onto the wildlife corridor. They stood there together, 2 small figures against the glass, waiting. The adults watched, amused but not really expecting anything to happen. But after just a few minutes, movement in the trees caught everyone's attention. A bear emerged from the forest. Not the same bears from before, but a different one, younger, walking with the distinctive gait of an adolescent. It came closer than any bear had come since the opening day, right up to the viewing window, and stood there looking at the children. The little boy pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging it up, and the bear did something unprecedented. It pressed its nose against the glass from the other side, exactly where the boy's face was. For a moment, they stayed like that. Child and bear, separated by glass but connected by something invisible and profound. Then the bear turned and ambled back into the forest, leaving everyone who had witnessed it speechless. The boy's mother was crying, moved by something she couldn't quite articulate. Other visitors were taking pictures, trying to capture what they had seen, but Haley just smiled, as if this was exactly what she had expected. Later, when Ethan asked her what she had whispered to the boy, she said simply, "I told him the secret." When pressed about what secret, she thought for a moment and then said, "That bears are just like us, but wearing different clothes." It was a child's explanation, simple and profound at once, and it captured something essential about what the center had become, a place where the artificial boundaries between human and animal could dissolve, where children could teach adults about the fundamental unity of all life. As the years passed, the center became known as a place where unusual encounters happened. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that people came hoping for their own moment of connection. The wildlife cameras captured incredible footage, foxes playing on the old bowling lanes at night, owls nesting in the rafters, deer bringing their fawns to graze on the specially planted native gardens. But it was the bears that remained special, appearing at moments that seemed deliberately chosen, as if they understood their role as ambassadors between worlds. Ethan often thought about his uncle during these years, wishing he could thank him for preserving this magical place. He had found more journals, more evidence that his uncle had known exactly what he was doing when he refused to sell or modernize. In one entry, his uncle had written, "Some places are doors between worlds. This is one of them. I'm just keeping it open until someone else understands." Ethan understood now, and he was determined to keep that door open for as long as possible. The golden bear charm that Ethan had found that first day became the center's official symbol, reproduced on pamphlets and T-shirts, but the original remained in a special display case near Lane 7. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, it seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if it contained within it all the magic of that first encounter. Children were particularly drawn to it, often standing mesmerized before the case, and more than one parent reported that their child had claimed to see the charm move, though, of course, that was impossible. Or was it? In a place where bears played games with babies, where wild animals came to visit as if keeping appointments, where the boundary between possible and impossible had proven to be far more permeable than anyone had thought, who could say what was truly impossible? The center had taught everyone involved with it that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people allowed themselves to believe, that magic wasn't something that had existed in the past, but something that was happening all around us, all the time, if we just knew how to look. One autumn evening, 5 years after the center had opened, the Marshall family was there for a special event, a presentation about urban wildlife corridors that was drawing researchers from across the country. Haley, now 8, was helping with the presentation, sharing her story with the confidence of a child who had never learned to doubt her own experiences. As she spoke, showing the video her father had taken all those years ago, something made everyone turn toward the viewing windows. There, illuminated by the setting sun, was a gathering of animals unlike anything anyone had ever seen. There were 3 bears, a mother and 2 cubs. There were several deer, including a magnificent buck with a full rack of antlers. There were foxes, rabbits, even a few raccoons. They weren't interacting with each other in the way prey and predator normally would. They were simply there, together, as if attending the presentation themselves. The researchers were frantically taking pictures, trying to document this unprecedented gathering, but the Marshall family just watched in quiet awe. Haley walked to the window, placed her hand on the glass, and one of the bear cubs. Not the original cub, which would have been fully grown by now, but perhaps its offspring mirrored her gesture from the other side. The moment lasted only a few seconds before the animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest as mysteriously as they had appeared. But everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something extraordinary, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about animal behavior. Dr. Chen, who had become a close family friend over the years, stood beside them as the last of the animals disappeared. She said that in all her years of studying wildlife, she had never seen anything like what regularly happened at this center. She had theories, something about the acoustics of the building, the specific configuration of the landscape, the history of the place, but none of them fully explained it. Finally, she had come to accept what Haley had known all along. Some things didn't need to be explained, just experienced and cherished. As they were leaving that night, Ethan noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. There, in the dust on one of the unused lanes, were footprints, small bear prints leading from the back entrance to Lane 7 and then back again. But the building had been locked all day. The security cameras hadn't shown anything, and there was no way a bear could have gotten in. He called Jessica and Haley over, and they stood looking at the impossible prints, and then at each other, and then they laughed. Of course, there were impossible bear prints. In this place, the impossible had become almost routine. They decided not to mention the prints to anyone else, to keep this one small mystery for themselves. It was their secret, their private reminder that the magic hadn't diminished with familiarity, but had only grown stronger. As they drove home, Haley fell asleep in the back seat, mumbling something about bears and bowling in her dreams. Jessica reached over and took Ethan's hand, and they drove in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them here. The center continued to thrive, becoming a model for similar projects in other cities. But none of them quite captured the magic of the original, the place where a baby had shown a bear cub that kindness transcends species, where an abandoned bowling alley had revealed itself to be a threshold between worlds. Visitors often commented that there was something special about the place, something that couldn't be quantified or replicated, something that had to do with the very ground it stood on and the history it carried. Sekou chapters of Part 1 completed. As the seasons cycled through their eternal dance, the Riverside Lanes Wildlife Education Center became more than just a place where people learned about animals. It became a testament to the possibility of a coexistence, to the magic that happens when humans remember they are part of nature rather than separate from it. The bears continued to visit, not regularly enough to be predictable, but often enough to keep the mystery alive. Each encounter was unique, each one a reminder that the world was full of wonders we had only begun to discover. Haley grew up with this understanding embedded in her bones, carrying with her always the memory of that first encounter when she was too young to know that bears and babies weren't supposed to be friends. She became a voice for wildlife conservation, but more than that, she became a bridge between worlds, someone who could help others see what she had always known, that the boundaries we perceive are often just illusions, and that magic is not only possible but present, waiting for us to notice it, to nurture it, and to pass it on to those who come after us. The golden bear charm remained in its case, catching the light, holding within its small form the memory of that extraordinary day when a trapped cub had turned out not to be trapped at all, but to be a messenger, a teacher, a friend. And sometimes, late in the evening when the center was closed and the shadows grew long, staff members swore they could hear sounds from Lane 7, not the mechanical sounds of a functioning bowling alley, but something else, something that sounded like laughter, both human and not quite human, echoing across the years, reminding everyone who heard it that the world was far more magical than most people ever dared to believe. The story of the baby and the bear cub became legend in their town, told and retold, each telling adding new layers of meaning. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, it remained simple and perfect. A moment when innocence met innocence, when kindness transcended fear, when a baby's pure heart had opened a door that adults had forgotten existed. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths come not from complexity but from simplicity, not from knowledge but from wonder, not from separation but from connection. And in the forest beyond the center, the bears continued their ancient paths, but now with a new understanding, a memory passed down from mother to cub of the place where humans had proven themselves capable of seeing beyond their own limitations. The young bear, who had been trapped in the bowling alley, grew to adulthood, had cubs of its own, and perhaps in whatever way bears remember and share their experiences, passed on the story of the day when a small human had offered friendship instead of fear, goldfish crackers instead of hostility, and in doing so had changed everything. The center stood as a beacon of hope in an increasingly divided world, proof that the barriers between us and the rest of the living world were not as solid as we thought. That communication was possible across the vast gulf of species difference, that magic was not dead but merely sleeping, waiting for the right moment, the right place, the right hearts to awaken it. And Lane 7 remained preserved, a shrine to that awakening. A reminder that sometimes getting stuck is just the universe's way of putting us exactly where we need to be. Years later, when Haley had children of her own, she would bring them to the center, to Lane 7, and tell them the story of their grandmother and grandfather and the day they discovered that the world was bigger and stranger, and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. And sometimes, if they were very lucky and very patient, the bears would come, drawn by something invisible but undeniable, to press their noses against the glass and remind everyone watching that we are all part of the same story, the same vast interconnected web of life that has been spinning since the beginning of time. The golden charm continued to catch the light, a small sun in its display case, and children continued to claim they saw it move, saw it pulse with life. And who could say they were wrong? In a place where the impossible had become commonplace, where bears and babies could be friends, where an abandoned bowling alley had become a bridge between worlds, anything was possible. The charm was just metal and history, but it was also memory and magic, possibility and proof that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest truths. And so the story continued, not ending but expanding, rippling out like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives in ways that could never be fully traced or measured. Each child who visited the center, each bear that appeared at the windows, each moment of connection across the divide of species, added another thread to the tapestry of understanding that was being woven in that special place. The bowling alley that had seemed destined for demolition had become something eternal, a reminder that endings were often just beginnings in disguise, that loss could become discovery, that the most ordinary places could harbor the most extraordinary magic. In the quiet moments between visitors when dust motes danced in the golden afternoon light and the building settled into its own ancient rhythm, you could almost hear it, the echo of a baby's laughter, the soft grunt of a bear cub, the whisper of connection that transcended words and species and logic itself. It was the sound of the world revealing its secret heart, the sound of magic being born from kindness, the sound of a door opening between worlds that had never really been separate at all. And in that sound was a promise that as long as there were children willing to offer their toys to frightened creatures, as long as there were people willing to see beyond their assumptions, as long as there were places where the wild and the human could meet in peace, the magic would continue, the connections would deepen, and the world would remain far more wonderful than we ever dared to imagine. The story of the baby and the bear cub at the Riverside Lanes Wildlife Education Center became more than just a local legend. It became a reminder that we live in a world of endless possibility, where the boundaries we perceive are often just habits of thought, where magic is not something that happened long ago in fairy tales, but something that happens every day when we approach the world with open hearts and willing eyes. It reminded everyone who heard it that we are not separate from nature but part of it, not masters but participants in a dance that has been going on since the world began. And somewhere in the forest, an old bear with graying fur might remember a day long ago when it was young and curious and stuck, and a tiny human with bright eyes and a generous heart had shown it that fear was not the only option. That connection was possible across any divide. That kindness was a language that every living thing could understand. And perhaps, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the forest was silver with its light, that bear would return to the edge of the trees and look at the building that had once been its prison and had become its bridge to understanding, and it would know that some encounters change us forever, marking our souls with the indelible ink of wonder.